Bobby Matthews is a self-proclaimed and self-advertised 5'7" slice of heaven who has been nominated twice for the Pushcart Prize, as well as being a Derringer Award finalist in 2021. His first book, Living the Gimmick, published in 2022 to wide acclaim and a few sales too. His newest novel, Magic City Blues, was published last month to rave reviews. He lives in Birmingham, and when he's not writing, he's procrastinating. Bobby would also like me to include a slight language warning for his piece today. I've looked it over, and it shouldn't curl too many hairs. Today, Bobby is reading Requiem for Birmingham.
Hey guys, first of all, before I get started, I just want to say support your local library for events like these, and just because they have a lot of pressure on them from outside sources. So, you know, places like this are phenomenal, and they foster writers, and they foster readers, and they foster community that's vitally important. So, with that said, because I'm short, I'm going to bring the mic down here. Frank drove the truck out of the garage and turned southwest down the Pinson Valley Highway. He followed the road through Tarrant and the eternal belching flame of the coke plant, and then through the northeast corner of the city, with its junkyards and chop shops, where every building looked run down and soot-covered like something out of the 19th century. He rolled past the Museum of Art on Reverend Abraham Woods Boulevard and caught a glimpse of the new football stadium. Just a dream back when Frank went to prison. In the distance, it was shiny and new. But Birmingham ate up the shiny and new, chewed it up and spit it out, marred with coal dust and ash and grit. It was Frank's kind of town. Nowhere had ever made him feel the way Birmingham did, even if things had changed in the 7 years he'd been gone. He didn't know the word problematic, but if he had, it would have struck him as the perfect way to describe the Magic City. The streets were potholed and traffic permanently fucked due to road work, either on surface streets or around the snarling knot of Malfunction Junction, where Interstates 65 and 2059 snarled together like a hangman's noose gone momentary slack before the drop snaps it taut. Cops seemed unable to do anything about the murder rate, 130-odd fatal shootings, stabbings, and assaults over the course of the previous year in a city of not quite 300,000 people. The housing crisis had exploded, and Birmingham's developers variously suffered and burgeoned as building costs skyrocketed along with the rent. And yet, it was still Birmingham. Indie music at Saturn or Zydeco, frenetic, desperate dancing in the clubs, throwback video games and cocktails at Paramount. The Alabama and Lyric theaters with their old-fashioned lights, their signs and marquees. Saw's Soul Kitchen, named Saw's for sorry-ass Wilson, the kid who'd owned the joint and died way too young. And Red Mountain, and the TV station call letters glowing red against the black night sky. The Vulcan statue with a spear tip pointed at the sky, and a face full of outraged laughter as if to tell God, I'm coming for you, you son of a bitch. The statue's naked backside pointed in an eternal mooning toward the suburbs. The city ringed by white flight towns with rich white neighborhoods where they complained about Birmingham and took glee in its every failing. Conservatives screaming and crying in faux outrage about how dangerous the city was, when what they meant was how black it was. And the liberals tut-tutting and wringing their hands and asking, why doesn't someone do something? Another way of saying how very black the city is, but good luck getting them to admit it. And then there are the pimps and the whores, the bartenders and the drinkers, the strip clubs and the dancers and the DJs, the chiselers and grifters of every stripe, the poor who, yes, are always with us, and the people who prey on them and the saints who pray over them. Birmingham was a place that quickened the pulse and made you step down hard on the buckled, uneven concrete sidewalks so they could hear you coming and know that you weren't afraid. A place that made your back unbend and your neck unbow. The traffic was a bitch, and you better put your wallet in your front pocket if you walked anywhere downtown. The homeless slept underneath the Rainbow Tunnel down near the minor league baseball field, and if you got south of the medical school, you could find any flavor of prescription drug you wanted and gallon bags of quality weed that the medical students and the bright-eyed and heavy-thighed girls in nursing school had come to expect. The cool kids and the ones that desperately wanted to be drank at the Collins Bar on 2nd Avenue and paid triple for it just so they could be seen. Working stiffs knew about Eagle's Restaurant and its long, low gray building on 16th Street North, while the hipsters and the yuppies waited in line for Bamboo or Highlands Bar and Grill or Automatic Seafood. It was Birmingham and Dynamite Hill and 3 dead little girls in the aftermath of the 16th Street Baptist Church explosion. It was the letter from the jail and Bull Connor and fire hoses, attacked dogs and blood on the street as a people fought to redefine themselves, even if the results had still been far from perfect. It was Kelly Ingram Park and the memorials to those girls, so that in death they became immortals, frozen in time, a memory that said never again, even as the South's bigotry changed its coat and came after gay and trans children. Birmingham is situated along the fossilized Dragon's Tail of the Appalachian Mountains, a city built on the coal and steel industries, and the shadows of that hard work survive still and keeps the city hard-edged and angry. It is a place anchored to its racist past, and yet hopeful against all odds of a better future. Zoom north and there's Caraway Hospital sitting empty and dead in a cemetery of deconstruction equipment, demolished now that a developer has finally gone crazy enough to put the ever-popular mixed-use development into a neighborhood that features homes just a tiny bit larger than the hard plastic houses that come with a Monopoly set. Caraway was a monolithic, crumbling hulk, blinded after all of its windows had been shattered once the place finally closed down back in '08. Drive by it at night with your tires crunching over broken glass and the building loomed. By God, it was right there on the road with you, like a giant troll that's crawled out from under the bridge to crunch your bones between its teeth. Roy Baker had taken this place away from Frank Walker. He'd done it easy, too. Sneaked up on him in his pressed khakis and his cheap badge, got Frank on tape. Roy got to be the hero in court, the courageous sheriff who brought the bad man to heel. But what was never said? Nature abhors a vacuum. And Roy was there to take over when Frank went down. It was almost like a turnkey operation. Baker went to Frank's captains and underlings alike and told them straight up that it was his way or the highway, and the highway meant a long trip downtown or an abandoned coal mine shaft at the speed of gravity. No one owed Frank loyalty like that, and no one showed it either. Business went on, maybe a little better, maybe a little worse. But there was one thing for sure. Baker was worse at keeping a lid on things than Frank had ever been. The drug trade through the Magic City blossomed under him, and in the eastern part of Jefferson County, whorehouses burned down when they didn't pay the man their protection insurance. People died, and it was swept under the rug by the sheriff's office. Cases marked open and unsolved. Chop shops either paid up or were burned out. Ahead of Frank were the 4 skyscrapers that dominated the city skyline. One of those, the John Hand Building, had belonged to Frank before he'd been forced to liquidate to pay the high-priced lawyer and her jury consultants who finally convinced him to plead his charges down and take a 7-year sentence. The jury doesn't like you, she told him one day, nearly a week into the trial. If someone would let him bring a rope into the box, I think they might start building the scaffold right there in the courtroom. So Frank had taken the plea and done the 7 years straight up. He'd come up for parole once and refused to go to the hearing. Parole wasn't shit, but the law keeping a handle on your back. Get violated for something stupid, something you just fucking forgot, and then you gotta do the whole other bit. That wasn't what Frank wanted. When he came out of St. Clair, he came out clean. Brand spanking new, a balloon without a string, ready to rise up and blow away to wherever the wind took him. A brand new man with the same attitude. The wind took him back to Birmingham. Of course it did. The city was what he knew.
Our next reader is going to be Brian Speck. He currently lives on a small farm in Alabama with his wife and their 7 children. He has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and spent time employed as a stonemason. From an early age, Brian maintained a keen awareness of the supernatural and has spent his lifetime investigating its truths logically, scientifically, and personally, attempting to understand the reality of the unseen and to what degree it influences the mind of mankind. His main work is his series Chronicles of Z, the third of which is currently in progress. Here with his short story Too Small is Brian Speck.
Too small. Life isn't easy when you're small. My name is Ronnie Wilson, and I'm the shortest kid in my 5th grade class, girls included. It's only natural that someone with such a small stature would also suffer from a lack of confidence when speaking. Whatever the occasion, whether in team sports, class participation, or casual conversation, I'm often overlooked. To most everyone, I'm just that kid. At least, since I'm practically invisible, the normal-sized kids don't pick on me. Not much anyway. Of course, for a kid like me, gym class presents a daily wide-eyed reminder of my differences. You'd think that my deficient height would give me an advantage in a friendly game of dodgeball, but it really doesn't. In contrast to my meek existence, the other boys possess an uninhibited fervor for life. For them, the joy of living comes as naturally as breathing itself. Whether on the field, in the hall, or in class, the guys' antics seldom cease. They incessantly razz each other and carry on, even after several warnings from the teacher. In the same way that they're perfectly at ease around one another, they have no trouble interacting with the opposite sex. Sure, the girls pretend to get their noses out of joint when the boys tease them, but they don't really mind. I can tell. They like it. A couple of normal kids even have steady girlfriends, but not me. None of the pretty girls want to talk to a runt. Although no one has ever expressly explained this to me, in my heart, I know it's true. In addition to my less than average size, there's nothing noteworthy about my intellect either. I mean, I make passing grades, but I'm certainly no prodigy. Shy or not, no great wit awaits at the tip of my tongue to spring forth in sonnet or song. No, a great orator I am not. I possess absolutely no charisma and not much more personality. My social standing is much the same. I'm the only child of a working class family. We live in a middle class neighborhood. I'm a small person with a small mind and even smaller ambitions. Despite my inadequacies, I do have 2 friends, Marlon Stevens, the class fat kid, and Thomas Flanagan, a wiry ginger-haired kid with intense facial freckling and a slight case of ADHD. Since their oddities remain as unremarkable as mine, together we found it fit to form our own quiet clique of 3. Today, I expected a day no different than any other. But on this day, something entirely out of the ordinary occurred. After school, Marlon, Thomas, and I stopped by the local grill for a bite. To date, our whole existence had been steeped in routine. We always stopped at the same restaurant, ordered the same food, sat at the same table, and oftentimes had the same conversations. Today, however, when I sank my teeth into my hamburger, I immediately experienced an intense burning sensation in the inner lining of my mouth. The pain itself was shocking and nearly unbearable, but the next thing I knew, something jerked me backwards off of my stool. I landed on the floor with a thud. Utterly confused, I remained still for a moment. When nothing more happened, I pushed myself up to a kneeling position and paused. My mind scrambled to make some sense of my situation. Then, just as suddenly, the pain in my mouth revived, and I found myself being dragged out the door by my face. Dumbfounded, Marlon, Thomas, and the other patrons looked on as some strange force dragged me from the restaurant on all fours like an unruly beast. It pulled me down the street, past the school, and towards the park. Many more people beheld the spectacle of my bizarre predicament as I passed, but these too only looked on like bewildered cattle, none of them offering the least bit of assistance. In the park, I perceived that I was headed straight for the lake. So far, I had somewhat allowed myself to be dragged to ease the pain. However, when I realized that I was headed for water, desperation allowed me to put aside the sensation in my mouth for a last-ditch effort to resist this horrible, unexpected journey. I flailed about and dug my feet and hands into the earth. I pulled up many clods of grasses and bushes by the roots, albeit to no avail. As I neared the lake, I realized that none of my futile efforts would prevent my fate. Before going under, I took one final breath, as much as my lungs could hold. I thought that my skull very well might implode as my mysterious tether dragged me to the bottom of the lake. With my lungs burning, I clung to what I believed would be the remaining seconds of my mediocre life. Something then tightened around my waist. It gripped me like a giant hand. I couldn't make out much in the murky depths, but before I succumbed to suffocation altogether, I perceived two great scaly beasts before me. In quiet contemplation, they studied me for a moment. Then, after sharing a quick glance with each other, one of them reached for my face. I experienced a great pain in my mouth once again, then nothing at all. My next memory was that of my two friends violently shaking me on the banks. As I coughed the water from my lungs, they shouted, "What happened? What happened?" I let my head fall onto the grass and replied, "I don't know. Too small, I guess."
Our next presenter is Jack Sharman. Jack is a white-collar criminal defense lawyer, a graduate of Washington and Lee University and Harvard Law School. He also holds an MFA in fiction from Washington University in St. Louis and has published in the Southern Review and elsewhere. Today he'll be reading an excerpt from The Whisper Book, his political thriller novel in progress. It is my pleasure to present to you Jack Sharman.
Night fell. A man turned the corner from Lafayette Square. Behind him, the White House was an alabaster box, blinding in the fury of its exterior lights. The man walked on and paused at the Stephen Decatur house, pretending to look in the windows of the White House History gift shop. He hesitated. Anonymous pedestrians, bundled up against the autumn chill, flowed around him on the sidewalk. Because of his size, people tended to give him space. He thought about Stephen Decatur, hero of the War of 1812 and the fight against the Barbary pirates. A returning war hero, Decatur had been the most popular man in the country, a potential presidential candidate. A wax museum in New Hampshire had done up Decatur's image and placed it next to one of George Washington's wax figures of power, wasted power. Decatur had died after being shot in a duel in Bladensburg, Maryland, a community today overrun by a swollen District of Columbia, but on the morning of March 22nd, 1820, still a quiet country village. Its seclusion had made it ideal for dueling, which was illegal in the district. Bladensburg had even been known as the Valley of Chance. Chance had not worked out well for Decatur. His thigh smashed by his opponent's bullet and arteries severed, the Commodore had been brought back to his home on Lafayette Square to die, which is what happens when power is misused, or worse, when one is simply careless. The man standing on 8th Street did not intend to be careless. The man glanced up the street, back up to where it met the yellow-painted part of 16th Street, now known as Black Lives Plaza. Satisfied that no one was paying attention to him, the man walked a few yards further down 8th Street, raised a gloved hand, and rapped on an ancient black door. He was admitted into the quiet, gracefully furnished house, his overcoat and cashmere scarf taken by a white-jacketed steward who the man did not acknowledge. He followed the steward along the passageway, their footfalls muffled by the oriental carpet. The light from sconces was soft on the eggshell blue walls. There was something austere, something American about the old federal style of the building, as though patriot ghosts of men long dead still twisted the doorknobs. Even the cream-colored wainscoting spoke a quiet reserve of power. He was led up the curved staircase to the second floor with its striking parquet tiles arranged in the careful attitude around a fireplace were 4 blue upholstered chairs, 3 of which were occupied. A fire popped and crackled in the fireplace. He had not known that the fireplace worked and made a mental note to not forget something like that. One could not forget things and do well with people like this. We could have met in my office. He shook hands with the 2 men who had risen from their seats. One was frowning and troubled. The other smiled as though a grandson's birth had just been announced. At my office or at the Metropolitan Club. The Metropolitan Club's more secure than your office. Lehman Brent, the frowning man, pointed at the Gibson a different steward was silently offering. But it's not worth a damn either. Senator Luckett Preston, still smiling, jerked his massive head towards the White House. Besides, I like to be close to our subject. Lehman Brent inspected his companions. Any more drinks? Then dismissed the steward. Senator Preston held a dark drink in a double rocks glass, an old-fashioned their visitor knew from prior experience, and waited until the steward had closed the door behind him. The president is a danger to the country, to civil liberties at home, and to our standing abroad. Jesus, let's sit down before the speeches start. Lehman Brent dropped heavily into his chair with a glass of club soda in his hand. He gestured at their female companion. You know the cabinet secretary, Shirley Grant. Of course, the visitor said. Last time was at an event at the Organization of American States building. Grant took his proffered hand, a good memory. She remained seated, cozy in the elegant blue chair, serene and Buddha-like, if Buddha had been a black woman with a pearl necklace, hair in ringlets, and excellent skin. Who knows, the man thought, maybe she is Buddha. She was also the most powerful black person in the White House, and he knew had saved this blustering white president from a half-dozen crises. The fire burned. On the wall behind the senator was a fox hunting scene. On the wall across from their visitor was a round fish-eye mirror. The mirror distorted the hunters, the dogs, the foxes. The visitor sipped at his Gibson. I didn't know you were such an advocate for civil liberties, Senator. Perhaps it has something to do with your chances to be the party's nominee. Senator Preston had first been a member of Congress, then a senator from Alabama since the mid-1990s. If he took the visitor's comment amiss, he did not show it. The senator inclined his head to the serene black woman seated between them. That may be for others to undertake, he added. There's a chance of impeachment. I've heard. Even if impeached, he may not have to leave office. We need something more. The senator looked to his companions for help. More stringent, Lehman Brent suggested with impatience. He was a lawyer, an old Maryland lawyer, and their visitor knew he did not like to beat around the bush. Bingo! Senator Preston slapped the arm of his chair and reached for his old-fashioned. Yep, that's it, something more stringent than impeachment. He slurped at the cocktail and watched the others from behind the glass as though it were breastworks. The Gibson was cold and there was plenty of gin in it, but the cocktail onions were not as good as the ones the visitor made and kept in a jar in the refrigerator at home. Providing the rail on which a sitting president is run out of town is a tall order even for me. He ran a big hand over his smooth-shaven scalp. Grant's voice was as serene as her demeanor. You might not need that big a rail. The Maryland lawyer stood, grabbed a poker, and stabbed at the fire. Give it some thought. We need something, as the senator said, more stringent. It'll be worth your while. He looked over at their guests. Pay a lot of medical bills. The room was uncomfortably hot with the fireplace. Of course the canny old lawyer knew about the medical bills. Their guests suppressed an urge to see if there were any messages from the nurse. And what is this thing that's so stringent? Brent rattled the poker back into the rack, replaced the fireplace screen, and remained standing as though the interview were over. The president, he's got secrets from college. Their visitor laughed, a guffaw he quickly got under control. Lee, everybody has secrets from college. The cabinet secretary turned towards him. Grant's face was still serene, the little ringlets in place, but her pearls were a whisper out of position. Her eyes brightened. He did not want to get sideways with that pair of eyes. Grant pointed back in the direction of the White House behind them. Not like this. Not secrets like this. The president's college secrets. She nudged the pearls so that they fell into a neat semicircle. The president's college secrets are in a book. We just need you to find the book. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Miss Nancy Dorman Hickson. After almost 20 years as a Southern Living and Progressive Farmer magazine editor, Nancy now freelances in Birmingham, Alabama, including co-authoring the memoir Diplomacy in Diamonds. The Mississippi native's own In Progress memoir draws on stories about the people of her childhood for answers to present-day questions regarding faith, loss, and awakening in today's divided world. She is a contributor to an anthology coming out this June called All Night, All Day, Life, Death, and Angels. Here's Nancy with her nonfiction piece, Job Hunting. No, make that job haunting.
Thank you. I park underneath the pine trees, doing a poor job of shielding the rusted eyesore of a trailer. After I knock, I turn and take in Oddfellow Memorial Cemetery. On the grounds, gravestones sprout, some white and new, others gray and crumbling, with dots of color from artificial and fresh flowers scattered among them. In the 20 minutes it takes me to get here after my last class, the paved road turns to gravel, with fewer and fewer houses and more pastures. The cemetery's isolation makes it seem more distant than the actual miles separating it from campus, where I've just sweated my way through an economics class. A buxom blonde woman with black roots opens the trailer door. "Hi, you must be Nancy," she says. Razor-thin wrinkles appear when she smiles, and I judge her to be a couple of decades older than my 19 years. I sit on a brown vinyl sofa and study the cracks as she looks over the resume I hand her. "So, you're a freshman," she says, peeling off her glasses. She leans back. "Where are you from originally?" "Here," I reply. "This is my hometown." "Oh, that's unusual. Most of our college applicants are from somewhere else." Next to her glasses, she sets down my resume, which outlines my past as a waitress, store clerk, and babysitter. "This job is simple," she explains, handing me a paper. "You'll make calls from this list." I see old-fashioned names, including an Ethel, a Lamar, and an Odell, and assume these are names of elderly people with one foot in the proverbial grave. Advanced age makes them hot leads for cemetery plot sales. My job will be to provide the initial contact to try to get a salesperson through the door of prospective plot buyers. "Your shift will be from 5 to 9 p.m., my interviewer continues. "Sometimes Mr. Jarvis, he's the manager at Oddfellow, or I will be here too, but most of the time you'll be out here by yourself." She scrutinizes me anew. "You okay with that?" Sure, I reply, shrugging. It won't bother me. It's an honest answer. I'm not a girl who fears the dark, even if it's darkness cloaking a graveyard. After dealing with cranky restaurant customers, snooty shoppers, and crying babies in previous jobs, I welcome a chance to work where peace is part of the package. I doubt the Deb will want to return their food, exchange a gift, or require a diaper change. She reaches in a drawer and pulls out a trailer key, walks from behind the desk, and hands it to me. Suddenly immersed in a whoosh of her Chantilly perfume, I stifle a sneeze. You've got the job then, she says. I start to rise and then realize our conversation isn't over when she perches on the front of the desk. So, cemeteries don't scare you. I could tell you some stories. She eyes me again, trying to decide if she should continue. I guess she believes my silent nonchalance conveys a kindred spirit. Blondie leans in closer, her overpowering perfume misting my eyes. Once, we found one of the graves had sunk in from too much rain. We had to hire a backhoe driver to try to bolster it. The guy got too close and the soft ground caved in. Her eyes sparkle and a sick little smile plays on her lips. The backhoe fell into the grave and cracked open the casket. Have you ever seen a dead person who's been in the ground for weeks? Yeah, that must have been bad, I say, rising from the sofa. I am eager to escape, but I need the job. I tell myself, she said she most likely isn't going to be here while I am. I'll be here tomorrow night, I say, squeezing past her and rushing to the door. Dead folks don't bother me, but this ghoul of a living woman does. To my relief, the macabre interviewer and I never crossed paths again. My first and only encounter with the boss, Mr. Jarvis, comes a few nights after I begin showing up promptly at 5 p.m. to start my call shift. He breezes in, introduces himself, grabs a cardboard box, and departs. After so brief an encounter, I couldn't pick him out in a lineup if I tried. I'm calling on behalf of Oddfellow Memorial, I sing-song into the telephone each weekday evening, catching some ancient person unaware as they make dinner or watch television. As I talk, I fiddle with promotional black matchbooks. Each glassy black square touts the cemetery's pitch. If you don't do it, who will? I tell the people who answer my calls, I'd like to talk about how we might help you plan for the future. I feel guilty about bothering these old souls. Some hang up immediately before I get out a full sentence, but many on the list are willing to talk to the young, disembodied voice of a stranger. The hot leads on my list are lonely, and they often reveal details about their lives they shouldn't. I live here by myself now that Joe's gone, one says. Or, I had such trouble with my credit card, I only use cash now, says another. The hardest conversations I have are the ones that go something like this. Could I speak to Mr. Evans, I ask, trying to put perk in my voice. Oh, a woman responds shakily. He's gone. Big sigh. He died last week. It was the cancer. Did you know, Ted? I'm sorry, I say, stumbling to extract myself. I am so sorry. The shame of feeling shady begins to wear on me. You don't use your name, do you? My dad asks when I tell him about my new job. He knows better than to protest the actual job, despite its dicey nature and location. I'll reject quitting out of pure stubbornness if he tries to tell me what to do. But the truth is, waitressing is looking more enticing by the day. I'm about a month into the job when I hear a car pull up outside one evening. The sound of wheels on gravel is extraordinarily loud in the still country air. I am 19 and stupidly trusting. When the man knocks, I unlock the door. I immediately regret it when I see his reddened face and smell alcohol and sweat. Where's my wife's gravestone, he bellows, pushing past me. I stammer. What? Oh, I don't know. Spit flies in my face as he yells again. Where is it? My entire body shakes. I know I just am about to join the dearly departed resting outside. I don't know. I just make calls, I blubber. I cringe away from his anger. Suddenly he crumples, sliding to the floor, back against the door. She's out there with no name, he moans, holding his hand in his hands. I stand rigidly a few feet away, unsure what to do now that his rage is melted. I'm sorry, I say softly. Tell me your name. I promise I'll have someone call you. Finally, he heaves himself up. I put the desk between us, but I grab a pen and paper and stretch it toward him. He leans over and scrawls his wife's name. He hands me the paper. Fat tears roll down his face, leaking away his bluster and whiskey. I'll have them call, I say, my hand trembling as I reach for the note. He weaves a bit, turns to the door, and wobbles down the steps. I lock the flimsy door, pull the blinds aside, and watch as he gets in his car and slowly leaves the cemetery. I should call the cops, but I don't. Instead, I grab my belongings, lock the door, and head home in case he comes back. The next day, I telephoned to deliver his message, and then I quit. I mailed back the key. Years later, my dad reminds me of that short-lived college job. That fella Jarvis that you work for at the cemetery, he says, he's in the penitentiary. I barely remember the man I met for only a few minutes one evening. As I said then, I couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. Turns out somebody actually did. If I would have predicted who would end up in jail, it would have been Miss Blackroot Blondie with a penchant for dead people. Her, I remember, down to her choice of her perfume. My imagination flies to our strange conversation about exposed corpses from a wayward backhoe. Were Blondie and Mr. Jarvis evil partners in some horrific ritual? What did he do, I ask. He ran off with the cemetery's perpetual care money, Dad answers. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Miss Wendy Kepley. Wendy is a Florida native. She counseled troubled teens and taught college courses for high school honor students. She and her husband moved to Alabama a year and a half ago to be closer to family, including 3 grandsons. She enjoys riding, kayaking, reading, yoga, and exploring waterfalls. Wendy's fiction has been published in literary journals and the Florida Writers Association collections. Several of her life stories have been selected for publication in the International Chicken Soup for the Soul series. Here with The Girl in the Black Beret is Wendy Kepley.
Emily sensed the end might come today. She sat on the open-air back porch, her favorite spot in the cozy, secluded cabin. After admiring puffs of white cotton clouds scattered across the blue sky, she buckled down, opening the laptop to work on her novel. Ever so often, soft wisps of air brought the sweet, subtle smell of laurel blossoms. On occasion, she could hear an airplane high overhead, breaking the silence but not distracting her. Someone pounding on the cabin door startled her. Bam, 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 a pause, and then it happened again. Emily struggled to get out of her chair and tottered to the front door, hoping to get there in time to make the noise stop. She called out, "Who's there?" When no one answered, Emily pulled the door open. She saw a girl wearing jeans, a dark t-shirt, and a black beret running down the rutted road and disappearing over the hill. Emily pressed her hand to her lower back as she straightened a bit. Her running away seemed odd, but something also bothered her. What was it? Oh, there it was. How had the girl gotten way out there? A car? A bicycle? Maybe a horse? Almost as soon as she identified what bothered her, Emily forgot all about it, closed the door, and made her way diligently back to the porch. She returned to her computer, concentrating on her most important goal. Suspecting that time was not her friend, she was driven to finish her latest novel. It was not at all like her numerous formulaic bestsellers, even though her romantic suspense series had been described as groundbreaking by the New York Times. Murmurs from the nearby creek sang to her, lulling her thoughts. Relaxed, she rose and leaned on the rough-hewn wooden porch railing to gaze out over the mountain valley, soaking up the peaceful beauty of the forest. With a deep sigh of tranquility, she shrugged out of her sweater and felt the fresh spring air on her bare arms. She took delight in observing the birds flit, chirping among green maples, oaks, and pines. Eavesdropping for a while, she was confident the birds were communicating, and wished she could speak their language. Finally, Emily sat down, eager to write, trying to stay focused. Her arthritic fingers stroked the keyboard, and words flooded into sentences. Sentences streamed into thoughts, and thoughts surged into wisdom, the wisdom she needed to share before it became too late. She picked up where she'd left off, quite close to the finale. Many, now dead and gone, have railed against the voluminous stabs into their health, the sharp jabs of broken bones, and even worse, the despondency that comes when the spirit is broken. The melodic notes of a wood thrush caught her attention. Her misshapen fingers froze in place as she listened, charmed to hear the bird so nearby. When the warbling tunes stopped, she continued. But a resilient woman lives to battle the separation of her existence from her soul. Her mind grows into a malignant mound of Swiss cheese riddled with holes, holes so large they suck life memories into the black void of nothingness. She will endure this, her final challenge, until the fated grace of death arrives to liberate her. Emily realized she was thirsty. She relaxed her arms and tried to rotate her inflexible wrists. She went to the kitchen. Emily often discovered things in mysterious places, apple peelings squirreled away in a dresser drawer, or a dish towel hidden in the cereal cabinet. Opening the fridge, she noticed her black leather pocketbook on the shelf next to the yogurt. A tink, tink, tink sounded. Was someone tapping on the front bedroom window? Puzzled, she squinted her eyes and set her chilled purse on the counter, heading down the hallway as if a magnet was drawing her toward the source of the sound. Through the window, she saw the same girl hightailing it up the nearby hillside. As Emily watched, she reached the top of the hill and once again vanished from sight. Emily stared out long after she was gone. After a while, she dilly-dallied back up the hall, pausing to enjoy the framed family photos along the way. Still thirsty, Emily found herself back in the kitchen. Locating the lemonade pitcher, her lips puckering in anticipation, she poured a small jelly glass full and drank it all in 3 gulps. She made her way out to the porch to return to her mission and sank deep into the soft pillows. Pulling her laptop closer, she typed nonstop, glancing up from her work only when clouds passed in front of the sun and sent shadows flickering over the wooden floor. She raised her chin and sniffed, sensing the moisture in the air, and wondered if it might rain. It seemed it was that kind of day. Bang, bang, bang. The puzzling noise seemed to come from up on the roof. It stopped, so she relaxed and resumed her writing, caught in the cadence of creating words, words designed to reach others, words to inspire. Thump, thump, thump. Emily frowned, slid her laptop onto the love seat and stood, her legs wobbling from the change in position. She waited until she felt steady again before going down the back steps to investigate. Once on the ground, she went around to the side and located her ladder leaning against the cabin. Emily put both hands on it and pushed to check to see if it was steady enough, then climbed the flat aluminum steps one at a time. She finally reached the edge of the roof. Across the top of the corrugated tin, she saw the girl again, her back to Emily. Then the black beret bobbed below Emily's line of vision and disappeared. Emily descended, 1 foot after another, lips pursed tight until both feet touched solid ground. At least there was no more racket, but her constantly returning visitor certainly had curious behavior. Was the girl worried that somehow Emily would forget who she was? It seemed that the young girl only wanted to be remembered, which was unfortunate because Emily's writing was all that mattered to her now. Out of nowhere, something touched her shoulder. She whirled around, wondering who could possibly be in her backyard. A smiling young man nodded his head and smiled innocently, as if he had not just given her a scare. Branches swayed in the breeze around them, although the skies had not yet darkened with the rain clouds she had expected. The swaying trees became pale green walls as the young man held out his hand. "Time for your pills, Mrs. Clark." He seemed to know her, so Emily nodded. His pleasant smile remained as he held out a small dish of assorted capsules. She tossed them into her mouth, reached for the little cup of water he offered, and swallowed them down. "I'll be back later to help you to the dining hall," he said. Her hands continued to dance across the keyboard, her wisdom pouring out for others to read, paragraph after paragraph, flowing onto page after page. Finally, she typed the end, sighed, and sat back in her wheelchair, quite content. There was a slight knock, and the door opened. The orderly re-entered the room. "It's your turn to go now, Mrs. Clark." Her work was complete. She was ready. She reached over for her threadbare black beret and placed it on her head.
Our next presenter is Skylar Randall. Skylar is the author of 3 fiction crime novels, Jacqueline Willoughby, Raina, and Francis Laurent, which won AudiobookReviewer.com's Best Thriller in Crime category award in 2021. He lives in McCalla with his wife Yvette and their West Highland Terrier Q. Skylar will be reading from his new book, set to be released in September of this year. It is titled Questionable Practice and is the first installment of his new series, The Good Doctors. Let's give a warm welcome to Skylar Randall.
Questionable Practice. Set in 1935, the book follows Robert Madigan as his whole life is upended due to the untimely passing of his father. Financially struggling and alone, Robert is preparing to leave school and give up his place as a medical school intern at the University of Pennsylvania. However, his esteemed professor, Professor Howell, offers an alternative. He sends Robert to meet with Gavin Knoll, a man who presents him with a lucrative financial proposition he cannot refuse. Robert becomes a contract killer. He recruits 2 fellow medical students and friends to assist him, Samuel Moore and Clark Magnuson. Their plans are meticulous, even flawless, offering each victim a choice of how they will be put to death, by the bullet or by the needle. Together, Robert, Samuel, and Clark earn the alias, the Good Doctors. In the following excerpt, Robert is faced with his first job as a contract killer. He has been assigned to kill an elite accountant named David Mazak. The scene opens with Robert's partners preparing the patient for Robert, leaving him tied to his office chair in the middle of the night. This is followed by an insight into Robert's perspective as he gets ready to commit his first murder. "Just tell me what you want," Mazak pled, his eyes wild. "The rope isn't necessary." In a sudden arc of movement, Samuel smacked the pistol across Mazak's face. A sickening crack echoed, leaving the accountant stunned and reeling where he sat. Clark stared at Samuel in amused surprise. He didn't think Samuel had it in him. From the bewildered look on Samuel's face, Clark could tell Samuel didn't either. Mazak groaned and swooned on his chair as his eyes rolled to the back of his head in disorientation. He tried to get up, but dropped immediately to the ground. Clark darted in quickly and lifted Mazak's lumbering body back into the chair. He tied the man's lower arms to the armrest, while Samuel yanked another rope from the satchel and tied Mazak's ankles together. The pair stood back and admired their work, watching as Mazak's head swayed in confusion. "I will say this is going quite well, Sam," Clark admitted. Samuel nodded in nervous agreement. He was a sweaty mess, his terror at his own actions palpable. But Clark was outwardly calm, and he didn't miss the mystified side-eye Samuel was giving him. "What time is it?" Clark asked, keen to get Samuel's thoughts back on task. Samuel checked his wristwatch. 11:33. Clark smiled. "Perfect. We're ahead of schedule." He bent over and whispered loudly into Mazak's ear. "All we have to do now is wait." In his room at the Belvedere, Robert inspected himself in the full-length mirror one last time. It was foolish to be worried about appearances before his soon-to-be victim, but he couldn't help but fret. For the millionth time, he considered a mask. Most executioners wore masks. I'm digressing, he thought with a scowl on his face. His new doctor's bag sat on the bed behind him. He checked and rechecked it several times within the last hour as he waited for the predetermined time. It was now 11:45. It would soon be time for Robert to begin the 10-minute walk to Mazak's office and earn the $4,000 already tucked safely into his vest pocket. Robert took a breath as a fleeting pang of guilt ran through him. It was a last-ditch effort from his conscience, no doubt, but things were already in motion. It was much too late for guilt to rear its head. Robert straightened his jacket and held his chin higher. It's like Howell said, these men deserve what they've got coming. I'll be doing the world a favor. He let the words wash over him, reminding himself that Professor Howell was the reason he was doing this. If Howell was involved, that meant what he was doing had to be good. Mazak deserved this punishment. Resolved to complete his task, Robert picked up the bag and headed down the stairway. He knew he could have taken the elevator down the 5 floors, but it was important he dispensed the nervous energy pulsating underneath his skin. He was a doctor, after all, and his hands had to be steady for the task ahead. The lobby was brimming with people, even though it was nearly midnight. The bar behind was lively, echoing the sounds of entertainment and patrons. Robert smiled with assurance. He kept his steps calm and calculated, knowing he needed to be inconspicuous. The less attention he drew to himself, the better. But the lobby saw thousands of faces every night. The chances of his sticking out of that number as memorable were as good as zero. Robert emerged into the chill air of the night with renewed confidence. He had painstakingly memorized the route he needed to take, so walking it as natural to him as the path he followed every night to his apartment. He turned to his left and began the short walk to Mazak's. The street was still moderately busy, another good omen. He maintained a leisurely pace, trying to appear as if he belonged. Robert had once heard that everyone walks past at least 36 killers in their life without realizing it. He was on his way now to becoming one of the 36. Stop it, Robert reproached his internal thoughts with a deep breath. He wouldn't think of what he had to do as murder. It was just work. Robert had rehearsed his walk earlier that day to be certain they would remain precisely on schedule. He tipped his cap casually to a passing couple, bidding them a good evening with a charming smile before approaching the office. It is where his associates had prepared the patient for his arrival. Robert eyed the dial of his pocket watch, ticking past the numbers. It was seconds away from midnight. As it passed the 12th mark, Robert took a deep, confident breath. He opened the unlocked door to David Mazak Accounting. Clark and Samuel will be out of sight, but nearby, just in case of any hiccups in their plan. Robert strolled straight through the darkened office space with the assurance of someone familiar with the layout. A light shone ominously at the end of the hallway, and Robert diligently marched towards it. The door to Mazak's office had been left wide open, spilling golden light out into the dark hallway. All was quiet, but Robert moved closer. He heard a faint moan. He took his 1,000th deep breath of the evening and conjured to mind the persona he created for himself. Not Robert the medical student, nor Robert the future doctor, but Robert the good doctor. He stepped forward into the doorway. The light became a halo around him, bathing him in an ethereal glow. Mazak was waiting for him, though quite involuntarily. His lower arms were secured tightly to the armrest, and Robert knew he couldn't bulge them even if he tried. But he wasn't trying. The man was reeling from a great gash across his face, evidently the work of Robert's associates. He was concussed and defeated by the time Robert laid eyes on him. A bunch handkerchief had been stuffed into his mouth to keep him from crying for help or pleading for freedom. Not that it was necessary. There was nothing the accountant could do or say to derail the course of events already in motion. Robert could sugarcoat his role all he wanted, but he had not decided this man's fate. He was neither judge nor jury. He was the executioner. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Miss Haley Moon. Haley is an Alabama native and started writing at the early age of 10. She believes in writing without bounds and writes across multiple genres, although her stories do tend to lead towards the macabre. In light of that, Haley would like to issue a trigger warning. Haley has been published in her alma mater's literary magazine, The Filibuster. You can find her short stories on the site Vocal Media, as well as follow her blog, The Weirdo Writes. When she isn't working on her manuscript, she's a proud cat mom to Nubby and Babe. This evening, Haley will be sharing Impure.
John looked up. Something circled overhead, creating a large shadow before it quickly vanished. They had never ventured this far into the woods, and it made him nervous. Put her down. His words came out harsher than intended. Suzanne stopped and followed her husband's gaze upwards. She quickly dropped her gaze to their daughter. In her arms, they needed to move before she lost her nerve. She was their offering to the spring. Their ask would be great, so their sacrifice had to be as well. A chilling wind followed by an eerie stillness that settled around them. Put her down. We can leave her here, John whispered. No, we must put her in the water. The water must take her. That's what the woman said. He tore his gaze from the sky and roughly grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her toward their destination. It was only about a quarter of a mile further. The area surrounding the spring was full of life. Prey and predator were at peace at its edge, and Susan dared to venture closer. Judd tightened his grip, but Susan shook free and continued forward, only stopping briefly to kick off the worn cowhide slippers. Her husband watched her until she stopped at the water's edge. She turned to him, her eyes slightly wide and cheeks damp. The burly farmer's lips turned downward. This was his plan. This was the only option they had, and he followed in his wife's small footprints, kicking off his torn shoes as he stood beside her. The tears were flowing freely down her mahogany cheeks, and John slowly brought his large, earth-stained hand up to gently cup her face. We have to do this, he stated, his hand moving to her free one. She hesitated, staring at him, searching for any indication that he had changed his mind, that they would abandon this plan and merely ask for another extension, possibly offer future crops as payment. Susan found no signs of regret. Briefly, she thought of running, taking her little girl and seeking safety in the village over from their home. But she knew no one in refuge. There was no one willing to take in a foreign woman and child. It wasn't from a lack of wanting to help. Truth was, no one in any of the villages Sebastian oversaw could support 2 additional mouths to feed. Food was scarce on the surface. She squashed any ideas of rebellion and took her husband's hand. Together they stepped into the clear water and began to walk to the center as the old woman had instructed. At the center, the water was only up to their knees. Submerge her, John stated, looking around in awe, his breathing becoming labored. She only nodded, keeping her head turned away from him. Slowly, she lowered the little girl into the crystal blue water. Dido looked up at her mother, her obsidian eyes wide as she raised and lowered her small, thin legs. She was giddy at the odd sensation of cold water on her skin. Let her go, he whispered, looking around. The flock of swans glided over to the edge, as if sensing what would come next. They stood on the bank, their long necks craned, 3 sets of dark eyes watching, waiting. Do it, submerge her. His voice was low and harsh. The young mother began to shake as she tightened her grip on the small hand in hers. Do it now. John repeated. His gaze on her was intense, and he moved, grabbing her hand and yanking Dido away. His hands firmly on the child's shoulders, ready to enact the unthinkable, so they could have the hope of a better life. Susan quickly placed her hands over her eyes, unwilling to watch. She and John had nothing else to offer, but she was worried. As a child, Susan had heard tales of these waters and the powers to grant your deepest desires. The coolness of the water began to wane, becoming warmer. Is this supposed to happen? Susan asked, removing her hands from over her eyes. John let go of Dido. The child fell into the water. He hissed. The water was becoming hotter. His skin had the sensation of pins. Susan screamed before she collapsed, becoming fully submerged. John picked up his left leg to move and screamed when only his thigh came above the surface. The flesh began to boil, and he too fell beneath. The last sound was of him gargling water. Daniel, where did you find this woman, child? Hamesh approached her son. He batted his green eyes, folding his wings tight against his body. She was near the spring alone. Out of instinct, he wrapped his long tail around the child, closing her off from his mother. The large elder dragon huffed. Probably another sacrifice at the behest of Lydia. That witch goes too far. I thought they would have burned her by now. Mother! Hamish waved her large claw. Your uncle is far too lenient with the humans. He should burn them all. The treaty, Mother, Daniel whispered. As long as the surface dwellers stay within their limits, we cannot touch them. Hamesh hissed, baring her teeth. The spring, you say? Daniel nodded. A sacrifice. I'm assuming she's too young to know how to ask from the waters. I would say a sacrifice that didn't go as intended. I watched as the parents were consumed. No respect for the ways of the land, making demands of the spring while lacking the proper intention. She shouted, causing Dido to shriek and huddle closer to the blue-scale dragon. Mother, please, keep your voice down. You are frightening the human child. I will not be quiet in order to appease the little meat sack. Intention, what do you mean? Daniel asked as he patted the top of the child's head with the pad of his claw. The spring, as with all the waters here, are givers. Many of the surface waters give with no need for reciprocity. But the spring requires payment. But, she held up her paw, the rewards are greater, but because the spring works for good as well as evil, it cannot accept pure souls. Realization dawned on him as his eyes went wide. Therefore, the woman child was not consumed. That's something. He looked down at the child, the smooth reptilian skin covering large egg white teeth, formed into a smile. You can stay here with us. He glanced up at the cave he shared with his mother, father, and young sister. Hamesh scowled. It can stay the night. At first light, take the woman child to the village. She turned, leaving Daniel and Dido alone in a huff. Daniel leaned until he was eye level with the child. Don't worry, little one. She'll come around. Thank you.
Lizzie Bowen is a poet and fiction author from Birmingham and enjoys writing and reading the work of others. She graduated from the University of Alabama with a major in English and enjoys being a part of the monthly writing group here at the library. The Bowen Book of Poetry, independently published in 2021, is a collection of poems unapologetically studying the inner workings of death, life, grief, self-image, depression, anxiety, loneliness, and everything it is to be human. Here with Stars in the Sand is Lizzie Bowen.
Izzy was often agitated, but not anymore. Right now he felt the oddest sort of serenity coming over him in overwhelming amounts. Izzy walks with sand in between his toes. He used to grow so tired of taking Miss Crutchfield home, but it was common practice at this point. Her body is heavy beneath his as he heaves her weight upon him. It feels like a journey with no bounds, walking to her house, which is a far distance, much farther than he had ever remembered it being before. The wind seems to howl with a vengeance. He heaves her back onto his shoulder. He can barely carry her body weight. She's refusing to cooperate and will not walk. There's a long, winding hill on the beach, and he begins to make his trek up. Izzy looks at the water as it sparkles ever so peacefully. The waves crash quietly, and he feels a strange sense of peace begin to wash over him like warm water. He makes his way up the hill, feeling his knees wanting to buckle beneath him. The weight of Mrs. Crutchfield almost feels too much to bear. She's chattering nonsense in his ear about this and that, people and places and times far away from the one they are currently in. Izzy is only half listening to what she is saying. 1,000 stars sparkle above him. Mrs. Crutchfield's house is close to the water. He totes her close to the house and tries to support her in her body weight as she begins to stumble up the stairs. A glowy, luminescent light fills the house. It's almost blinding. The house seems to float and glow. "We're here," she says with a smile. Izzy feels confusion, but a good sort of confusion. He cannot explain the odd sort of peace that rumbles within him right now. Izzy backs away slowly from the house in its blinding white light. He wonders why it doesn't burn his corneas. Light that bright must burn. "Don't be scared," she said. "I'm not," he said, almost too quickly. He said it so quickly it burst out of his throat and vocal cords like a shot. The one thing Izzy was not feeling right now was scared. He still could not describe the peace that murmured within him. He walked slowly to the water. Miss Crutchfield was singing to herself and laughing. Her laughter roared like thunder and seemed to be echoing throughout the entire beach. Izzy walked to the water. He saw little pictures in the water, glowing like orbs. They looked like pictures of children laughing and dancing. Izzy spun around, and suddenly it all came back to him. The litter of glowing figurines within the water were memories, versions of himself from long ago, snapshots, glimpses of his childhood. Everything came flooding back. He had been sober for over a year. It was a relapse. He remembered his ex-girlfriend coming over with her backpack. The backpack almost always meant trouble, and it always contained the things that he loved so much inside of it. He told her he was sober now, but she had insisted. He had never been able to resist her or her backpack and the electrifying sensations that she held within it. In rehab, they'd read him stories about when you've been clean for a while that your body can adapt to your old ways and dosages. Your body can't seem to withstand the amounts that it used to before. They drilled that into his head. But one last time, he tied elastic around his arm, and he went back to the older version of himself from a year ago that he had been trying to escape. Escape is the right word, but he always said clean up because it sounded better. He was cleaning up his act and his ways. Getting better was also one that he often said, and of course the good old cliche recover. He hated that word, because do you ever really recover? Perhaps this was the only recovery he had ever known. With elastic pinching his arm, he looked to his ex. He almost seemed to love her in these moments. He ran back to his ex's house. His ex, Indigo, was now sitting beside Mrs. Crutchfield. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Where I always come from," she replied. He nodded and looked out into the glistening water. "1 whole year," he whispered. "You did good. Lots of people wouldn't have even made it that long," Indigo said. He smiled. He loved Indigo while she was on Earth, even though they fought and never seemed to work. He did love her down there, and he knew that he did. "A year," he said again. Indigo smiled at him. Light seemed to be popping out of every pore of her. Not that she even had pores anymore. Whatever shape they were in now was not human. It was so much better. Miss Crutchfield was still singing her happy little song. This was Izzy's home now, and it was everything he had ever wanted. He was at peace now, and it was so beautiful. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Phil Fishman. He considers himself a late bloomer when it comes to serious writing. After graduating from Indiana University with a degree in chemistry and an ROTC commission in 1961, Phil Fishman served 2 years in the Army Chemical Corps, mostly at Fort McClellan, Alabama, where he met his wife, Sarah. When Sarah had a stroke in 2008, Phil then became a combination caregiver and writer. He had been a voracious reader of science fiction and historic fiction in his younger years, and now had some time to read and think about writing. His first book, published in 2010, was a memoir of his experiences with teaching. He has since written and self-published 6 additional books. Phil confesses to a wild dream that his last book, which he feels is his best, might find its way to Steven Spielberg's attention. Titled The Game, it involves a flashback to the Crystal Knot, otherwise known as the Night of Broken Glass. Many consider this evening to be the start of the Holocaust and was the inspiration for his short piece tonight, The Twins, a meeting on a historic day.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody. An old lady lay on her hospital bed reading a front page article on the London Examiner. 50 years ago, today was the greatest invasion of history, and there were countless acts of selfless courage that have been discussed over the years, but one today deserves special mention. Only a few weeks ago, through DNA testing, were we able to unravel one of the mysteries of that day and thereby reveal another remarkable act of courage associated with an incredible coincidence. It is well known that the action at Omaha Beach that day was very different from that of Utah Beach, just 29 and a half miles apart, or 14 miles as the crow flies. But when one compares the number of casualties at the two beaches, or even at the other three beaches, Sword, Juneau, and Gold, one can see that there was something very different. For one, there was a steep cliff just beyond the beach at Omaha. And secondly, that cliff afforded the Germans an excellent vantage point on which they had a series of concrete resistance bunkers armed with a devastating assortment of weaponry, including 88 millimeter anti-tank guns, rocket launchers, machine guns, mortars, and small arms fire from the 352nd Infantry Division. That the Americans were able to prevail at even a horrendous cost in lives was nothing short of a miracle. But that miracle was aided substantially by the paratroopers who had landed earlier that morning and were able to attack the German emplacements from the rear. And that's where the story begins. This was an interview from 1945, shortly after VE Day, with one of the brave American Rangers who had scaled the cliff in that face of withering machine gun and small arms fire. Me and my buddy, Roger, had just gotten to the top of the cliff when we saw the most far out show ever. Two Krauts, a sergeant and his buddy, were shooting at a bunch of other Krauts, diverting their attention away from us. We had no idea who was who, but we decided to side with the two who were engaged with the larger force. We figured if we survived, we could deal with the two better than that whole gang they were shooting at. By that time, a whole bunch of our other guys had managed to come up over the top and joined in the party. When it was all over, there were about 20 or 30 dead Krauts around the 88 millimeter gun pillbox, along with our two dead Kraut friends. Although there were rumors that they were really Americans dressed in Kraut uniforms. Whoever they were, I'm sorry I wasn't able to thank them. I figure I'm alive today because of their actions. We tossed a couple of grenades into that pillbox, but when we opened it up to see how many other Krauts we zapped, it was empty. Weird, weird. Later, A U.S. Army major confirmed through his dog tags and fingerprints that the Americans dressed in a German sergeant's uniform was Johnny Goldblum. The other individual lying next to Goldblum had a name tag identifying him as Fritz von Schockenberg. A captured soldier who had been one of the crew manning that 88 millimeter gun was interviewed, and he said that a sergeant accompanied by a private had rushed into their pillbox and told them that he and his crew were needed urgently at an adjacent pillbox 20 meters to the east. Months later, after further investigation, it was determined that Goldblum and his German friend von Schockenberg were the ones who had brazenly emptied that pillbox without a shot and had gone on to engage 30 or so of the enemy in a firefight that allowed a number of U.S. Rangers to come up over the top of the cliff with few casualties. Goldblum received a posthumous promotion to sergeant and a Silver Star, and both Goldblum and von Schockenberg were posthumously awarded Croix de Guerre medals for their bravery. But the story doesn't end there. On a hunch, Goldblum's younger stepsister arranged for exhumation of the graves of her stepbrother and friend, and DNA testing of the two. Lo and behold, the results confirmed that they were identical twins. Separated at birth, two hero brothers were joined in death. The elderly lady's nurse called out, "Frau von Schockenberg, your lunch is ready." But the old lady did not stir. The newspaper was draped over her chest. She would have no further need of meals. But she had a smile on her face.
Our final presenter of the evening is Sean DeArmond. He is a discovery writer, meaning he often goes into a piece with a general idea of how a character may or may not negotiate through an obstacle, but kind of lets things happen in unpredictable ways. Through this approach, he has acquired a collection of poems, stories, song lyrics, comedy sketches, and in one odd case, a text-based adventure game. Today, he presents The Haunted Hayride, a journey in hay that straddles the line between creative nonfiction and fiction that's possibly non-creative. I present to you now Sean DeArmond.
It's a nice, crisp autumn afternoon because I say so. I don't know how often we think about this, but when you're basically God, the line between true and not becomes practically irrelevant. So, this is a true story. Doesn't matter if it isn't. A horse-drawn wagon full of hay rolls towards me, driven by Misty, a character I've known since I was 14. She's my inner poetic voice. I write poems through her. I used to anyway, but even today I know she's always around. And today she's driving the fictional wagon. In the landing area is the cast of The Carousel, Karis, Zell, and Brandon. Karis is her usual pillar of enthusiasm, and I love narrating the story through her voice. It's more fun being in her head than mine. Brandon is still a bit of a blank slate. I haven't really nailed down his personality, but my urban fantasy romance adventure, whatever the hell it's going to be when I finally publish it in probably 2053 novel, needs an everyman. And Zell, Zelfina Blade. That last name's just a placeholder. My asexual succubus who made the jump into my writing from the Lotus campaign, an RPG which ran for 8 years back in the 90s, kind of a Planescape, Sailor Moon hybrid with less dice roll. You know what? You don't need to know this. Joining them are my overly pleasant big bad wolf from my puppet show script, and Walter P. Sullivan, who you may recall from the core of PSD, where he shot himself to get out of a committee meeting. I feel I owe him one. So, we're doing the thing? Asks the wolf. The thing, I forgot to mention, is a haunted hayride. This is October of 2015. I've been blogging for a year and a half. Oh, it's the 100th blog, Karis jumps in. And to celebrate this milestone, we, i.e. past blog cast members, have been summoned to take a journey down the dark trails of our host's mind, a foray into the nightmares of a child. Man, she's better at this than I am. Okay, follow-up question. Why? It's Halloween season. What better way to celebrate the season of the spectral than a tour through one's own personal hauntings? Now, I want to point out, for an ensemble standing in the presence of their creator, none of them have taken any interest in me. Brandon and the wolf are focused on Karis, Walter P. Sullivan is staring into nothingness, and it's only at this point Zell gives me the side-eye. There aren't going to be spiders on this thing, are there? No, no spiders. Shall we go? Do we have a choice? Okay, I wasn't expecting that. Is there anyone who doesn't want to be here? Nah, I'm just messing with you. The wolf messes my hair as he climbs into the wagon, and I've learned something new about him. We're all now in the wagon, trying to ignore the fact that Walter P. Sullivan is staring expressionless at some random point among us. The first sight you can see way over there is the braying donkey. This was an animatronic on a boat ride called the Old Mill, presumably meant as a jump scare. There was a flash and a hee-haw on hoofs and everything to a child that looks like a monster. Brandon leans forward. I can barely make it out. Yeah, sorry about that, but this isn't actually my memory, it's my mom's. Throughout her life, she had a kind of phobia of dark attractions, which I'm pretty sure started here, and I think somehow it may have rubbed off on me. Although, in her case, it seemed to be the darkness she couldn't handle. For me, it's the animatronics. Up next is a medieval-styled wall with a huge Humpty Dumpty on top, frozen forever in an off-balanced pose. I notice Zell moves closer to Karis and stares into the hay. This is Storyland in New Orleans, a children's attraction where you can wander among nursery rhyme and fairy tale characters. The wolf's ears perk up. Hey, I'm home. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, you kind of are. So why is this a nightmare, asks Brandon. The uncanny valley isn't doing anything for you? Okay, this is why. I came here several times, never had a problem. But one day I asked if I could walk this one loop on the pathway by myself, and for whatever reason a 5-year-old has for that, I'm walking alone, and it suddenly dawns on me that being out of sight of any other living person, I actually am alone. And I've got this egg, King Cole, Miss Muffet, a cow, and Jack Horner surrounding me, and they're all staring at me. And there was this kind of dread that entered my emotional lexicon that day and never left. I can tell I've confused Brandon. Why are we doing this? We as in, well, you. What's the point of this? I don't know. It's my blog. It's up to Karis to rescue me again. Things that scare us have a certain power over us. You know that fight or flight defense or freeze? Sometimes they throw in a few other F words in there. Not that one. But one of the ways people conquer their fears is to friend them. And I think this tour is a way of showing these things respect. Okay, well, now we're at the River of No Return, one of those Six Flags Jungle Cruise knockoffs where the sights start off innocent enough until the boat accidentally takes a wrong turn and everything becomes humorously gruesome. Now, I want you to imagine you're a 6-year-old on this thing for the first time. You see the human skeletons with the vulture, and you see the crocodile with some guy's hand in its mouth. And that sense of 6-year-old morbid curiosity opens your vulnerable soul up to absorbing the whole experience, and then you float past some carefully placed foliage and come face to face with the head of King Kong. You were not expecting this, and you're just as likely to drop to the floor of the boat as you are to jump overboard. I am told I chose the former. This SOB is the Chernobog of my nightmare world. The tour continues through all manner of creatures, from various miniature golf courses, the bear from the cave in Opryland, a whole slew of stuff from Disney World. You know the witch from the Snow White ride literally tried to kill me? When I worked there, I got to perform in her costume once. I thought that was going to be cathartic, literally getting inside her head. She was terrifying on the ride, and I was excited to inflict some of that on other people. So it's time to go out into the park, and I'm already practicing my Marty Feldman hobble. I take 12 steps and realize the mask is suffocating me. Moving on, the tour portion is over, and now we're just kind of riding in the wagon. And Brandon asks the group, "What are you guys afraid of?" Kara says heights because it's part of her character. No, I don't mean that. I mean, as fictional characters, do we actually have something to be afraid of? Sure. Wolf points to Walter P. Sullivan. How about him? Is it the vacant stare? Well, think about it. He was created like we were. He doesn't have a backstory or a family or goals or funny lines or even a description. He's just a name. His whole existence was confined to a single story. He was born, lived, and died in about 1,000 words. Now he's just there. What happens to us when we no longer have purpose? Karis mutters something about Julia Gibbs from Our Town as she dozes off. Now there's silence. And I can't help but wonder if maybe my characters don't think of me as God. Time must be pushing 11 now. Walter P. Sullivan is gone, probably forever. Most of the wagon is asleep. So I put my head up front where Misty suddenly speaks. In solitaire, are you still there, imaginary friend? In empty prayer, I'm unaware, imaginary friend. Though wear and tear and disrepair the mavens dare to mend, we rarely share a sitting chair, imaginary friend. Perhaps 'tis worse immersed in verse the curses left unpenned, than face the wrath and aftermath of tokens that offend. With full reprieve, inept I grieve, believe, not comprehend. And yet I tell you, rot in hell, you ancillary friend. You're a bitter woman, you know that? Zell. I've been half expecting her to crawl over to me through all that hay, yet now that she's doing it, I feel strangely unprepared. May I ask you something? Of course, sweetie. Why do you hate me? I wasn't expecting that. Zell, you're one of my main characters. Why would you think I hate you? When I started, I was fun. I was energetic. I actually laughed. Now I'm just angry and hurt all the time. Well, you're a 30-year-old character who's crossed mediums. You're naturally going to evolve as the story needs you to. I mean, do you feel like you should be happier? I'm not asking you to change me. I just want to know why. Okay, you're angry because I am. I heard about things that I can't control, between mental health issues that I don't seem to ever find solutions for, and the fact that the world always seems to be on fire. I don't have anywhere to put those emotions except into a fictional character. That's why you get my phobias and my depression and all that, so at least I have some way of processing. Oh shit. You never asked for that. I just wanted what any fictional character wants. To matter. You do matter, Zell. I know those are just words on a page, but let me explain why. I've had thousands of characters come in and out of my head. I've forgotten most of them. I even have some names written down. I have no idea who they were supposed to be. But somewhere in that lifetime of noise, there was you, waving to my brain and saying, there's something here. And I believe you. I want you to shine. Do you know that you exist in a book in this very library? That means at least some part of you has already been released into the world, and maybe nothing else ever will. But I'm going to keep trying, because you matter to me. Does it always have to hurt so much? Yeah, and I'll tell you why. Because fiction writers are cruel. You're our children. We abuse you and we kill you. It's what we do about the things we love. And you, Zelfina Blade, I hate that last name. It's a placeholder. You're my favorite. And I know you can take whatever I throw at you because you're stronger than I am. And when I see what you withstand, it makes me feel like maybe I can withstand what the world throws at me. Okay. I take the horse's reins from Misty and place them in Zell's hand. Go on. Take us somewhere.